Peace, everybody. It's your brother, Marc Lamont Hill. Welcome to Night School. Every night here on the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel, we hold Night School. We break down the most interesting topics, the most controversial subjects, the most urgent debates going on in the world today. And tonight is no exception. I am excited to have this guy on the show. I am a fan of his. I am a literal follower of his. Half the content you probably see on this show comes from him in some form or fashion, directly or indirectly. You know, we're at a moment where journalism is failing us. I mean, particularly political journalism. We're at a moment where all sorts of questions arise about the integrity, the quality, the consistency, the intention, the viability of journalism as a field. And every once in a while, you get to meet somebody who does the work, who's committed to the work, and who does it with skill and dignity. And I got to say, humility. So I got to bring them in. Y'all, you may not, I know how to use these buttons, I promise. You may not, this is what happens when I work without a producer, Aaron. Everybody, this is Aaron. Do you pronounce it Rupar or Rupar?
Rupar.
Aaron Rupar. I only because I follow you on Twitter. I never see you do a lot of on camera stuff. But you're a legend in social media right now. Thank you for the work you do, everybody. Aaron Rupar, if you don't know, is one of the most important journalistic voices, I would say, in the country right now, if for no other reason but just holding Donald Trump accountable. Regardless of whether you agree with Trump or don't agree with Trump, although this is definitely an away game for a Trump fan, you you absolutely have to believe that we have to keep track of what he's talking about, just like you do with Kamala Harris, just like you do with everybody else. Anyway, Aaron, let me start at the beginning for those that don't know. Sort of, how did you get into this space? How did you become this person now we look to for such insights?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to join you. And man, that was a really nice intro. So I hope I can live up to that. Rarely do I hear such nice things said about me, especially given the time I spend on social media and what people say about me there sometimes. But yeah, I mean, I've been doing the video clipping work now for over 7 years. Feels like a really long time, but I kind of stumbled into it. I was an editor at Think Progress back in 2017, which people might remember. It was a newsroom that was in the Center for American Progress. And my boss there was Judd Legum, who people probably still follow. If you follow me, he does the Popular Information newsletter. But I had a training in the newsroom there on this video clipping service called Snapstream. And it was a newsroom-wide thing that we did. And then one evening, I just happened to be sitting at home. I had Fox News on in the background. And John Kelly, who was then the White House chief of staff for Trump, was on with Laura Ingraham. And this was right after the Charlottesville protests and demonstrations and the violence that occurred there. And John Kelly on Ingram's show is basically doing the heritage not hate thing about the Confederacy, saying that, they were just kind of trying to honor history with Trump's defense of the Confederate monuments and not, defend racism or anything like that. And so, it kind of hit my ear as wrong and, sort of a weird thing to say on national TV. And so I thought back to this training that we had just had on clipping and posting on social media. And so I posted a clip of John Kelly saying this stuff on Ingram's show. And by the next morning, it had like a couple thousand retweets. It was easily the most viral thing I'd ever posted. And at that time, I was an editor in the newsroom. So, it was easy for me to kind of integrate video clipping into my workflow. I started watching a lot of the White House press briefings around that time, which, Sean Spicer back then was the press secretary. And I was already watching a lot of the Trump rallies anyway, because part of my beat was covering Trump. I was an editor and we had a bunch of reporters who were doing a lot of reporting out in the country, doing reporting trips. And so I was kind of like their point of contact in the newsroom, and I'd edit their stories, but then we needed someone just to cover Trump because we didn't really have someone doing that. And so it was kind of a natural fit into stuff I was already watching a lot of anyway. And my account just kind of grew and grew exponentially. And, from there, I went from Think Progress to Vox. I was at Vox for about 3 years. And then in the fall of 2021, I decided to go independent and launch the Substack. And so it's just grown and grown. It's something I really stumbled into. It wasn't, I never set out with the intention of doing video clipping or video work, but there was a need for it at that time. And now it's like a really saturated marketplace. I mean, but between myself, ASIN, other people at Midas, Justin Baragona. Like there's so many people kind of in this space now. It's become a lot more competitive because like when I started, I'd be watching these White House press briefings and posting clips, and there was really nobody else doing that.
Yeah.
So I kind of had the field to myself, and now it's become in some ways a little more stressful because it's like, if I miss the first 5 minutes of the Trump rally, there's 10 other people clipping it, and so you're gonna miss out on those clips. So it can be kind of totalizing in that way, but I feel kind of it's cool to kind of be one of the OGs in that space and still be doing it all these years later.
It's interesting that you say that. You absolutely are the OG of this. When we see the marketplace get more saturated, at least with cable news, it sort of changed the way people did cable news. It seemed like people wanted to get the story first more than they wanted to get it right. Are there any similar dangers for the work you do, where people are rushing to get the clip of the rally?
Oh
Does that
yeah.
come in ways?
Well, it's a daily thing. Even this morning, I was clipping some of Maria Bartiromo's show, which is kind of a regular thing for me because she has a lot of high profile guests on her show. But the problem is that she's also disseminating lies all the time, and so her big lie this week has been this notion that FEMA has been using money that should have been used for storm relief for migrants, which is something Trump has been saying a lot too. But she'll bring on, like, she had Kevin Cramer, the North Dakota senator, on this morning, and it was kind of this lie fest about FEMA using funds for migrants. And so you oftentimes have to sort of have the fact check in the back of your mind that you can add to a tweet or like a post on Threads or wherever it may be, so that you're not just like spreading the lie. You want to be able to kind of fact check the lie, but it's such a fire hose sometimes that can be kind of difficult to do that. Or if it's kind of a new lie, it takes a little bit of time to figure out what the truth is. So yeah, I mean, there's always it's a really dicey thing when you're covering Trump because you don't want to just uncritically spread what he says. And I think at this point, for me, most people who have been following me understand that, like I'm not trying to amplify BS. Like most of the time, if I'm amplifying something, there's a reason to something hateful that he's saying, or I'll have a fact check right in there. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of part of it, is that, yeah, you want to be first with clips, but you also want to make sure you have the appropriate context, so that if there's someone who isn't following me or isn't a close follower of American politics and they come across something that I post, that they don't end up being misinformed, by what I post, that I actually, even if what I'm showcasing in the clip is a false claim or a lie, you want to have that added context so that people know what the truth is. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of similar to reporters who cover Trump and sort of the debate whether you should ever just quote him, which you really shouldn't. You should always have kind of the added context in there. But it's a similar dynamic with video clipping, where there's that temptation to be first and to push things out as quick as you can. But that comes at a cost. And so you want to make sure that you're kind of finding that right balance between quickness, but also having all of the context.
Has that taught you anything about the I don't want to say the intellect, but maybe the media literacy levels and the sophistication of the average news consumer? Because I would think that I would have thought, not now, I would have thought at one point that if you just posted a Trump press conference where he's telling people to drink bleach or something, that people would sort of understand that you're posting it to show the absurdity of it. Or if Trump posts something, says something ridiculously untrue and unfounded about a Mexican judge, or a political victory that he had that never happened, or whatever the thing is, that people would sort of get that. But it seems like you almost have to be didactic and really beat the point home that, hey, he's lying here, because the audience doesn't necessarily get that right away.
Mhm.
Am I too cynical, or is that part of the calculation here? Is like, what's the level of understanding that the audience is going to have?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. That you do have to account for the fact a lot of people who are engaging with stuff that I post aren't super high information. Although I will say that on Twitter, it's a little bit of like a self-selected area where, even people who are right wingers, who are Trump fans on Twitter, are fairly highly engaged, I would say. So, it's not like something that you might put on like a local news broadcast where people are really low information and maybe just getting like a 20-second news snippet that kind of forms their worldview. But yeah, I mean, that is part of it. And that was actually, you bring up the bleach thing. I mean, that was a really weird era as well, because, of course, like there was a lot of misinformation, whether it was bleach or ivermectin, back in the day during these Trump news conferences that he would do during COVID. And that was really challenging because obviously I don't have a background in like medical science. I'm not a doctor. But that was a really good example of kind of some of the difficulties involved. And that was actually a more immediate case because, if people listened to what Trump was saying, it could, literally be dangerous for their well-being in their communities. And there's kind of a similar thing with like some of the lies that he pushes about voter fraud or election fraud, where, might not be like immediately dangerous, but for people who believe this stuff, it can be. Like another good example is, Trump and Maria Bartiromo, Hannity, Laura Ingraham, like they're all in on the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which is this idea that Democrats are supporting migration into the country because they want migrants to become Democratic voters and kind of crowd out or dilute the white vote is basically the long and short of it. And whenever I post a clip from like a Trump rally or a cable news segment of a host or a guest pushing this stuff, I make sure to kind of bracket that this is a conspiracy theory that has inspired numerous right-wing mass shooters. To kind of highlight the danger, because you might watch one of these clips if you don't know what's going on and kind of hear them, a Republican say something like, "Oh, Democrats support migration because they're trying to create new voters," and that might not to like a normal ear sound that scary or dangerous, but when it hits the wrong person who is motivated, maybe they already have racial animus in them. And then they hear that and act out. You have to account for all different sorts of contingencies, all sorts of different people who will engage with stuff that you post. So yeah, I mean, that's a really kind of tricky thing. I assume most of the people who engage with my stuff have been following me for a while. And so, we'll kind of understand where I'm coming from. But you do have to, always have in the back of your mind how people respond to things who are new to it or don't follow politics closely, and what that might do to them, if you're not responsible in terms of kind of contextualizing everything that you post.
Does the media protect Donald Trump either intentionally or unintentionally? I mean, there's a way in 2020 where I felt like we had, after 4 years of just absurdity, maybe even 2016, there's a point where Trump said something crazy every day, something offensive every day, something unfactual every day. So there was no outrage when he did something that for most candidates could sink a campaign or at least kill a news cycle. It was like we couldn't be outraged all the time, And then there were people who just didn't care. And then of course, the people who were invested in him winning, people who support him. So there's all these different types of people and types of reasons why someone may not be holding Trump accountable. But at the end of the day, the question still remains, does the media do a good job of holding him accountable, or do we somehow end up protecting him?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right that he gets protected. And I think one of the big ways that happens among like the elite media outlets, like the Washington Post, New York Times, is that Trump, a lot of his lies are very repetitive. Like he will say them at every rally during all of his interviews. And so there's this, he kind of wears people out in the sense that it stops being new. And, for reporters, newness kind of equals news. If it's not new, it's not interesting. And so, I think that's one of the ways that he's kind of hacked the media, is that, a lot of these lies that he pushes, the first time he says it, it sounds really outrageous and it'll get some coverage, and like reporters on social media will highlight it. But then by the 20th time at a rally, he invokes the same lie about windmills or something like that. People kind of tune it out, and it just doesn't really, strike people as news. And that's really easy for someone like myself or like these reporters who are immersed in it to draw that conclusion. But, just because something isn't new doesn't mean that it's not notable or significant. And so, yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the ways that I think he's kind of hacked the media. I will say that, I thought in 2020 reporters got better in terms of dealing with Trump, kind of broadly speaking, where, with some of the lies about like mail voting or election fraud that Trump was teasing basically that entire year. I mean, you think back, he was posting things on Twitter in the summer of that year about how mail ballots were fraudulent and how, votes should basically stop being counted on election night. And, he's telegraphing, kind of his attempt to end up stealing the election that he ended up putting into action after the election day came and went. But, I thought reporters got better in kind of calling that out. I mean, I remember the New York Times specifically was calling some of the things that Trump was saying about mail voting lies, which is a word that they rarely use in their coverage. But I feel like there's been a little bit of slippage this time around. And, we're kind of back to, being kind of credulous with a lot of things that Trump says, or trying to present this election as kind of like two choices that people could make that are, like Coke or Pepsi instead of, dictatorship or freedom kind of thing, which I think is a more appropriate framing for this. But yeah, I mean, definitely, I think that if there was kind of, if reporters were committed to covering significant stuff and not kind of like sensational stuff or new stuff, I think that the framing of this election in the mainstream press would be very, very different. But I also think, on kind of a deeper level, people are just there's a lot of hate out there. There's a lot of people are just kind of like fed up with the system as it exists. And I think that the appeal of Trump kind of goes deeper than anything that the media could really solve on its own. I think, the media ends up being kind of like a convenient punching bag for people. And that's not to say that they're perfect and don't make mistakes, but I just think that there's kind of this there's a lot of resentment out there in the country as we see with the abiding appeal that Trump has.
Yes.
It's a really difficult thing to kind of wrap your mind around and make sense of if you're not part of that worldview. And it's terrible that we're going to be sweating this out until election day, if not even further. And I'm concerned. I'm not totally sure that Kamala Harris is on a path to win this.
I'm not sure he is either.
Yeah,
I mean, if you would have asked me a month ago, if you'd asked me 2 months ago, I said no way. Right at the top of her campaign, I was very concerned that she couldn't win, just because I didn't think Biden could win. Just where they were. Kamala Harris expanded the electorate, brought in all these exciting new people, new voters. Existing voters were saying, "Hey, we'll give you a shot." Some of the Michigan types, and by that I mean young people, college people, brown people, strong anti-war voices, were like, we're going to begin from a place of a strong maybe as opposed to a hell no. But it feels like she's lost that she's lost that room for sure. And I'm not sure if her campaign strategy is going to play out in the long term. And the thing I'm thinking specifically about is, this narrative, at least, that she doesn't engage the media enough. As a media expert, do you think Kamala Harris is talking to the media enough?
This is kind of a tricky question because if you say that she isn't, people will point out that, she did a podcast this week, the name of which I'm forgetting, but it's like the number 2 podcast in the country. It's the word daddy is in the name of it. I've never watched it before, but that was one where a lot of people were saying, oh, she doesn't do enough media. And then other people were saying, oh, she did this podcast, which is actually really huge with young people.
Call Her Daddy podcast. Call Her Daddy podcast.
Yeah. And then earlier this week, she was on 60 Minutes this week, which was kind of a big deal. And the framing for that was, watching the 60 Minutes piece, they led with, because Trump, of course, was going to do it as well, and then he backed out. And
that was a great intro.
Yeah, it was saying like, they were mad that we were going to fact check, and we told them that we fact check every story that we do, which obviously looks pretty bad for Trump. I mean, I think my broader concern with her campaign strategy is that there are these weeks where it seems like she lays pretty low, and obviously she's the vice president, so she's been down in the Southeast, looking at storm damage and meeting with officials down there and like doing things that you have to do when you're vice president. But then Trump is out there, doing multiple rallies a day. I mean, he's been in Wisconsin like 3 times over the past 7 to 10 days doing rallies.
Yeah.
And, he says all sorts of like terrible stuff. And, I've kind of gone back and forth with someone who clips his rallies where it's like, I think these rallies do him more harm than good in a lot of ways, because I think for, people who are kind of mainstream voters, you see the stuff that he's saying and like some of the ways that the crowd engages with him. And it's very alienating. I don't think he's really like, growing his base or winning new voters or adherents based on these rallies. But I still think there's a sense where, with immigration and the economy, there's a lot of discontent out there. And so when the election kind of reverts to Kamala Harris not really making news, laying pretty low, and Trump out there doing a lot of stuff, even when it's outrageous, and he's saying things that end up making it into clips that look really bad for him, I think kind of the ambient, like the ambient, I don't know if vibes is the right word, but like people haven't been really happy with how the last 4 years have gone. And I would argue that they're kind of misplacing their blame in a lot of instances. But, if the election kind of reverts to a referendum on, the way that people have felt about the past 4 years and kind of a continuation of the Biden administration, I think that's kind of a losing bet right now. And so I feel like it's better for Kamala to get out there and kind of proactively make the case, make news, do rallies, do TV hits. And I feel like there hasn't been enough of that. And I think we saw a little bit of that where like J.D. Vance obviously is completely loathsome. but he does these rallies where he takes questions from reporters, some of them not friendly reporters, and he's made a lot of unfavorable news for him.
I was going to say it's
Yeah,
like
I
he's
mean, this
actually.
one of the times where he took questions recently was where he said that even the legal Haitian migrants in Ohio he would deport because he believes that TPS isn't like fully legal immigration, so they're actually in his mind still illegal immigrants that he would deport. Like that was bad. He said really damaging things about Trump's healthcare plan, such as it is not really a plan, but that they would deregulate the insurance markets and basically make it unaffordable for people. But like I think doing these events sort of seasoned him for a decent debate performance, which was all it was all style over substance. I mean, Walz was much better on substance than he was on style. But Walz hasn't been out there doing adversarial TV interviews or like taking questions like that. And I think it does kind of prepare you for moments like that debate to come through with stronger performances. And there hasn't been much of that on the Harris Walz side. Now, I will say that this could look really silly in a month. I mean, I think there's still a scenario out there where Harris ends up winning Arizona and maybe North Carolina, and ends up not being as close as people are kind of fearing that it will be, or she ends up winning instead of losing. But like even earlier this week, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal citing internal polls that Tammy Baldwin has done in Wisconsin that has Harris 3 points behind in Wisconsin. And like, that's one poll among many. The averages still in Wisconsin have her ahead. But, I think if this election was coming up next week, it feels like a coin flip at best, given the Electoral College map. And kind of the last arrow in the quiver for Harris, it feels like, is hitting the campaign trail with Obama, which is happening now over the next few weeks. And like, we'll see if that moves the needle. I mean, of course, Obama campaigned for Hillary in 2016. And, so I think people keep waiting for the one thing that'll kind of break this election open and give people some room to breathe and not be totally stressed about it. But I just look at this. I look at this electoral map, and it looks a lot like 2016 to me. So this might be kind of like the PTSD of having lived through 2016. But I noticed that when I make these points on Twitter, there's a lot of like denial. There's a lot of people who don't want to hear it, who attack the messenger. So I just hope that there isn't a sense of complacency. But I will say what you want about Trump. He's out there campaigning. He does multiple events. He's on TV all the time. He's making news. And
is he doing a good job,
helps
though? Is he doing a good job? The more I watch him, the more he seems more lethargic. I watched a few, at least clips. I don't watch the whole rally, but there wasn't a lot of applause a few times. It seemed like the crowd seemed more somber, maybe even dead. You know what I mean? Is there Trump fatigue, or is he not as good at this? His mind wanders even more than it did in the past. He doesn't seem sharp. Maybe I'm catching him on bad days, or is he actually slowing down?
I think he is slowing down. If you watch, and I saw someone posted this recently, a clip from one of the 2016 debates that Trump did, and then a clip from the Kamala Harris debate. It was one of those kind of like shocking, when you saw them back to back, it was like, oh my God. I mean, this guy has aged a lot, which, obviously when you go from being in your early 70s to 80, like that's a pretty significant gap of time in one's life where like it's understandable there'd be some age decline happening there. But yeah, like his rallies, I mean, again, like I don't think his rallies really help him, but I think in terms of like an organizing tool, like getting all of his followers in one place, like giving them sort of an action plan, go back to your communities. And like, he does not have a traditional ground game this cycle, but he's doing kind of like micro-targeted ground games where, you go to his rally and then find 10 of your acquaintances and get them to vote. Not that the Harris campaign isn't doing these things, but, what I've noticed as this election between Harris and Trump, which has obviously only been going on for, a couple months now, given the switch in the ticket in late July. But what I've noticed over and over is that when there are periods of time where Harris kind of lays low because either she's busy with the duties of the vice president or for whatever reason she's not out there campaigning, even when Trump is out there making all sorts of negative headlines for himself, the polls tighten. And we've been in one of those cycles, early this month where I think Harris has relatively been laying pretty low and Trump has been out there. And we've seen the polls tighten, especially now, and we also have to factor in the effects of these storms that have hit the Southeast, which I think given the egregious lying that Republicans have been doing, trying to smear FEMA and turn it into a hate campaign against migrants. Like, I don't think any of that is helping Harris necessarily to the extent that people believe what Republicans are saying. So, I think that's a big variable in two states that were huge in terms of expanding the map for Harris with Georgia and North Carolina. And the polling that's been done recently, for whatever it's worth, has shown Trump, kind of shoring up his margins there and pulling ahead in Georgia again. And if he wins Georgia and North Carolina, then you're looking at Pennsylvania as kind of do or die for Harris, and that's basically a coin flip. And like I said,
Yeah.
there's internal polling from a Democratic campaign in Wisconsin as Harris behind, whatever that's worth. So, again, I mean, we have a few weeks left. I think Obama certainly will help. As being kind of the biggest rock star, I think politically that Democrats can put out there with Harris. But it's going to be a coin flip. And when you look at the state of Trump, like you mentioned, when you watch his rallies, when you listen to what he's saying, I mean, there's a deeper problem here. And even Trump losing, I don't think we'll fully address that. I mean, I think that there's a lot of kind of hatred and anger out there. And it's just a really hard thing to wrap your mind around.
Absolutely. Before you go, I want to ask you just one more question. What is the state of political journalism? There's really two pieces. The first question is that I think coming from a position that you come from, which is I'm going to report on this, I'm going to fact check, but I'm also going to make certain kinds of claims. I heard you say earlier, this is a question about democracy versus a dictatorship, for example. There are people who say journalists shouldn't say things like that. All we need you to do is call balls and strikes. You shouldn't be making any judgments, any normative claims. You shouldn't be doing anything but telling us the who, what, when, where, and why. What do you say to those people?
Well, what I would say is that there's really no journalists out there who can leave their values entirely at the doorstep, because even like the choice of what you're covering, has like some value decisions built into it. Now, my background, I come from progressive journalism. I've really always had jobs all the way, from when I was a local journalist in the Twin Cities to, working nationally. Like I've always had kind of progressive values embedded into what I've been reporting. So, it doesn't feel like a contradiction to me. But I mean, even, the choice of what pieces the New York Times features on their homepage, there's some political values embedded in that. And so I just think that, there's also just the reality that this election, it goes much deeper than any sort of like policy disagreements that people might have. I mean, it's very fundamental in terms of what type of society we want to be. And so I think you need to, just in terms of accuracy as journalists, kind of convey that to people, explain to them that like, this debate that we're having over kind of minutia, especially like during the Democratic primary. I think back in like the 2020 primary where like the minutia of healthcare policy was dissected endlessly. And like that, not to say that's not important or that doesn't matter to people, but now, we're coming on an election cycle now where the choice is really like, are we even going to have, free and fair elections going forward? And so I think, we need to accurately convey that to people. I mean, Trump, there's a very notable clip that I think, again, this was one of those things that isn't necessarily new, but he had a rally last weekend in Wisconsin where he went on a riff over the whole controversy that developed after he said he wanted to be a dictator on day one, like 6 months ago. And in the course of, he kind of framed his riff on this as though he was saying that he doesn't want to be a dictator. But basically what he did is he restated, like, I only want to be a dictator to close the border and to drill, baby, drill, like those two things. And then that's it. So he was basically like reaffirming that, yes, he wants to be a dictator to do these two things. And I posted this clip and like, it was kind of people, it basically got like a yawn. I mean, it got some retweets, but, it's one of those things that he said before, so it's not new. But like this should be, in a more kind of sane country, this would be a headline on the homepage of major publications. Like presidential candidate says he wants to be a dictator. But it kind of gets, instead the media is kind of obsessed with media narratives about like, is Harris doing enough interviews or like, has she flip-flopped on her policy views, things like this, which in the grand scheme of things, if Trump wins and our democratic institutions are really degraded even further, 5 years from now, it's going to look as ridiculous as the coverage of Hillary's emails does in hindsight in 2016, because obviously that was kind of a media obsession at the time, but like, did it matter?
Back just a little bit, Aaron, because there's my concern is that once we as journalists determine that those are the stakes, and I think your assessment of the stakes are right, but once we do that, does that then make us not do our job on the other side? So, for example, we really think Donald Trump is a much better option than Hillary Clinton. If we operate from that premise, I'm sorry, rewind. If we operate from the premise that Hillary Clinton is a much better option than Donald Trump, and we do all we can to highlight Donald Trump's awfulness, and we say, relatively speaking, that the Hillary email stuff is relatively unimportant in light of what Trump has done and also what he promises to do. we're now making a decision to not just call balls and strikes,
Mhm.
right? We're now saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be covering this email thing. Whereas the American people may actually want to know that, or maybe a better
Mhm.
example, more directly, is during those debates between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The whole conversation was, will we be fact checking Trump?
Mhm.
And we should, but there were at least a couple of moments where Kamala Harris said some things. For example, she brought up sort of uncritically these uncorroborated claims of mass sexual violence on October 7th, right?
Mhm.
Now, there are lots of people who, that could have been fact checked, right? Now Donald Trump's talking about Haitians eating people or eating
Yeah.
animals, right? So
Yeah.
again, you know, that's red meat for media. That's an easy thing to jump on. That's an easy thing to talk about. The other thing is, for all the reasons, right? It's complicated, it's
Mhm.
controversial, people don't want to touch, it's a third rail in mainstream corporate media, all that stuff. But there's a way, I guess I worry that because we have an investment in one person winning or another, whoever you are, because Fox News
Mhm.
has theirs too, that we somehow let the other candidate off the hook, and that might not be good for democracy either, because now corporate Democrats don't get critiqued, or on Fox News,
Mhm.
the Trump doesn't get checked, or whatever the thing might be. Is how do you think about that when you're assessing those stakes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of proportion. I mean, I certainly think that, when it comes to foreign policy, or, nothing that I said is to say that Kamala Harris shouldn't be fact checked or critiqued, or that, that journalists should be cheerleaders and kind of, put on a Democratic jersey and cheerlead for her while, just criticizing the other guy. I think the email example is an especially egregious one, because, that was like a front page story in the New York Times a week before the election. And I think,
That's true.
almost, I think very few people in hindsight would agree that that was worthy of that level of coverage, kind of like banner headlines in the New York Times. Now, Harris's policy on Gaza and Israel, that is a more substantial one. And so, and I think that's also an area where it's really easy to draw a contrast with Trump as well. But so in that instance, I mean, I would have had no issue with moderators pushing back, even though if I'm remembering that debate correctly, there was very little fact checking. I felt like Harris actually kind of had to do it on her own more than moderators jumping in. Although I guess they did on a few points, right? They did with the Haitians
Abortion
eating pets thing. Yeah, there were a few where
and
the
the
moderators
abortion.
jumped in.
But
Yeah,
again, and that's the challenge with Trump, right?
yeah,
He says something inaccurate every 32 seconds. I'm picking that number arbitrarily, but he
yeah.
lies constantly. It's like, if you fact check them all the time, you wouldn't have a debate, or you would look like you were a shill for the Democratic Party, because you'll hold them accountable. So I agree. I think it's a proportion question.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, I hope we get to a point in a few months where we can kind of resume infighting among Democrats and talking about, details of foreign policy and healthcare policy. And again, I come from a background of progressive journalism, so I've never really made any bones about the fact that I don't like Trump, and I think that he's a threat. And and other outlets have different commitments. But like another example that jumps to mind is, I remember right before Biden dropped out, and I posted a tweet about this. I pulled up the New York Times election homepage, the 2024 election. And the entire page was just stories about Biden's age, endless. Is he too old? Should he drop out? And it was, there was nothing about Trump. And it's like, is that really the biggest deal in this election? I mean, certainly Biden at that point, there were legitimate questions about whether he could do the job for another 4 years, and what was going on with him cognitively. And like, those were legitimate things. But, you have the other guy promising to be a dictator. And like, we should, just because that isn't like a new and sexy thing every week doesn't mean that it should be totally shunted aside. So I
Man,
don't pretend that these are easy questions. And I think you're right to kind of push back and to, really kind of examine what
it's
the proper
tricky,
role of,
man.
yeah. But anyway, I mean, it's interesting to kind of be in this liminal space that we're in here in October, where it's like, these conversations in a month, either we'll look back and you and I will sound kind of silly for being worried about Harris's prospects, or it looks like we'll look back and think that we weren't worried enough about things. So,
We'll find out.
yeah, maybe I guess let's talk again down the line. We'll do another episode, and
We will find
yeah,
out, man. Hopefully, after the election, it'll be a Trumpless world, at least political world, and we'll know for sure, man. Aaron, thanks so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate you, man.
yeah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Everybody, that was Aaron Rupar, one of the great journalists doing the work out here, with great courage, and great uh, skill. I would argue. Obviously, I disagree, as I was beginning to say before we ran out of time. I corporate Democrats, or Democrats in general, they're all corporate, need to be critiqued and challenged as well. And I think that sometimes, because Trump poses such a legitimate threat, we focus all of our energy in making sure he doesn't become president or isn't successful. But if he wins, it's a different reality than if he loses, right? In other words, if Trump loses, and we've done all the fact checking and critiquing like we saw in 2020, but we did nothing with Biden, then are we prepared to really hold a Biden presidency accountable? How do we hold space for the possibility of a third party or an alternate vision, even among the major parties, if we're only critiquing one? So, and I'm not, and to be clear, I'm not saying that that's what Aaron is saying. Aaron's saying tell the truth no matter what. But I think if we're always saying the stakes are so high, the stakes are so high, the stakes are so high, as journalists, I'm not talking about as voters, I'm talking about as journalists. If we say the stakes are so high, we got to make sure that Trump doesn't win. I worry that sometimes that leans into an area where we're not holding everybody accountable, and that's how we end up, with some very, very troublesome Democrats in office. But there's a long moment where Donald Trump wasn't being watched, he wasn't being overseen, he wasn't being critiqued, and Aaron Rupar was there. He was intense, he was strong, he was consistent. I mean, he's being humble, but even now, when there's a lot of people out there doing the work, and there's a lot of people who are really kind of chasing him, trying to kind of copycat what he's done. But the difference is they're just trying to be first. Aaron Rupar does his best to not just be first, but to be accurate, to be strong, to be critical. And that's what democracies need. Democracies need journalists. And journalism, and I've been a journalism professor before, and I've had to sit in a room full of students and have this conversation. Like, we got to be honest, we got to be fair. Objectivity is not what I look for. I look for fairness. And, I know that when I'm telling a story about anything in politics in particular, there are power dynamics at play that I don't want to ignore. So if by objectivity you simply mean we're honest about what's going on, that's fine. But too often when people say objective, they mean act like you don't have a point of view, act like you don't have a nickel in this quarter, act like you don't have a value attached to this. And that leads to these both sides arguments. We're not both sidesing the invasion of Gaza. We're not both sidesing the invasion of Lebanon. We're not both sidesing climate change. I'm not going to both sides spanking your child. These are not debates to me. And so bringing our values to the table is important. But even as we bring our values to the table, we still have to be honest and tell the truth. And that's why the state of political journalism right now is so complicated and messy, because there are people who don't have Aaron's integrity. There are people who just don't want to tell the truth. All of it is messy. All of it is complicated, because oftentimes the people that don't want to tell the truth are the ones who have the biggest platforms and the most money. It's the corporate media outlets. So that's why it's great to be independent. That's why it's great to tell the truth on your own platform. And that's why it's great to be, as Shirley Chisholm said, unbought and unbossed. That's what I'm talking about. Anyway, thank you for watching Night School. It's been great. Everybody hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that join button. Be part of what we're doing here. Corporate media outlets win because independent media outlets are silent. So if you can, hit the like button so that our communication, our message to the YouTube algorithms is, hey, we in this game, we in this fight. We can't win this fight if y'all don't hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. It makes our social media footprint bigger, which then allows us to get the content out to more people. And of course, if possible, please, 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 please hit the join button. You can hit the join button if you're on the desktop just by clicking join. If you're not in the desktop, look in the description. We left you a link to join. Become a monthly subscriber to the channel. You can become a bronze member for only $3.99 a month. I absolutely believe that it's worth it. You'll get early content, you'll get extended content, you'll get extra content. But you also get to be part of what we're building here, which is an infrastructure for independent media. Also, if you don't want to make that monthly commitment, you can go to Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, or Zelle. Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, or Zelle. Use those platforms and you can drop anything you want, man, from $1 to $1 million. We're grateful for all of it. But if everybody watching right now were to drop at least $10, it would allow us to meet our financial goals for the month. If everybody here dropped $10, we could meet our financial goals for the month. So please consider it. Anyway, family, thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.